Hi there. On this cold, windy day here in North Carolina. Sorry, shoot. Anyway, on this cold, windy day here in North Carolina, um, I am here to discuss a celebration or an acknowledgement of uh, of a very important American, one of the most important Americans in the 20th century, who really doesn't get the credit he deserves because the history books are so biased. I mean, reactionary right wing historian David Barton thinks that the history books slants too far to the left. I don't think so. I think that there's been a whitewashing of a very strong part of American history, which was our domestic socialist movement, our American socialist movement. And I want to discuss one of the most important people of that movement by the name of Norman Thomas. Norman Thomas. Anybody who's at least a boomer would remember him in the history books, and people from the World War II generation, the greatest generation to ever live, would remember him. Oh yeah, Norman Thomas. He's that guy that ran for that's the socialist for president in the 1930s and 40s. Um, Today in America, we hardly know about Norman Thomas. There is a Norman Thomas High School in New York City, and the students don't even know who the hell Norman Thomas was. Isn't that sad? The teachers, some of the teachers don't even know. It's all deliberate. It is all deliberate. Well, let's talk about Norman Thomas. Norman Thomas, as I said, is not widely known today, but was probably, no, was one of the most important Americans of the 20th century. Most notably, the socialists, the most socialists that ran for president from 1928 to 1948, who influenced Franklin Delano Roosevelt to doing the right thing to get us out of this Great Depression. Now, again, I mentioned revisionist historians earlier. And there are people today that are like, well, DR did not get us out of the depression. His program's prolonged it. You mean giving people jobs actually made shit worse? Really? I you know, I get upset when people try to distort the truth. We need the New Deal was needed. And not only was it needed, it didn't go far enough. But anyway, I'm sidetracking. Norman Thomas was the man that influenced FDR to do what was right for the economy, which resulted in the New Deal. He was he started off as a Presbyterian minister. Then he entered politics full time as a socialist and worked for socialism. He worked for the peace movement around the world and for civil rights and civil libertarianism here domestically. His name was Norman Mattoon Thomas. He was born in Marion, Ohio, as I said on this day, November 20th, 1884. His father, Weddington Evan Thomas, um, was a Presbyterian minister. His mother was Emma Williams, a homemaker. Norman Thomas had an uneventful, kind of comfortable middle class upbringing. He attended Princeton University. I believe that Woodrow Wilson was one of his professors. And then afterwards attended the University Theological Seminary. in 1911, he was ordained as a Presbyterian minister, and he started to work in East Harlem in the Italian immigrant section of the city. His congregation were of Italians who were formerly Roman Catholic, predominantly, that converted to Presbyterianism. He saw the widespread poverty, and he was moved to try to do something about it. So he focused, like a lot of ministers in mainline Protestantism over the years, focus on the social gospel. And Norman Thomas is very much proof in the context of when it comes to religion and politics that you can be a Christian and not be a narrow-minded, greedy, bigoted, asshole like people that supposedly speak for Christianity today, like the John Hagees and the Pat Robertsons and the Jerry Falwells, the late Jerry Falwell and his son Jerry Falwell Jr. Or people like these pastors on TV that preaches intolerance and neocon wars and worshiping of Donald Trump. Norman Thomas was proof that there was another way, that you could be a man of faith and you didn't not engage in bigotry, intolerance, greed, war. And there's a long tradition of that in America, the 20th century. As I said, Norman Thomas, A.J. Musty comes to mind, and I give you somebody today that sort of fits in that line in the American socialist tradition. And I've been trying to encourage Reverend Dwight Welch of Billings, Montana, to start a YouTube channel, because I think his message will resonate really well. But he's of that tradition too. But anyway, getting back to what I was saying, Norman Thomas basically was, his mission was to try to fight against poverty and economic injustice. He was a Republican initially. Now, here's the thing about it. When the Republican Party was created in the 19th century, during the days, in the mid 19th century, you could argue by today's standards that the Republican Party was created in the 1850s, since it was an abolitionist organization overall. You can argue that was a left-wing party, and you can argue that the Democrats of the South were the right-wing party. You can make that argument. My politics, personally, in the year 2020, if I was stuck back in the 1800s in a time warp and I had to live life in the latter half of the 19th century, I would have been a Republican. Before I discovered in the late 19th century the Social Democratic Party of Eugene Debs. And that is, knowing if my essence could be inside of a person living in the 19th century, that's how I would have evolved. I know I'm getting really weird by saying that. But anyway, again, the Republican Party has a tradition of progressivism too. Unlike today, as I said, you had, whether it was Horace Greeley or Abraham Lincoln, there was always people in the Republican Party who fought for social justice. back at then. It went on into the early 20th century with people like Robert La Follette of Wisconsin, a radical Republican senator whose politics mirrored that of Eugene Debs and Norman Thomas, so much so that in 1924, Robert La Follette created his Progressive Party with the help and the infrastructure of the Socialist Party of America. Unfortunately, it collapsed, and in that Labor Party that Americans keep trying to piece together keeps collapsing. Theodore Roosevelt, more or less, there are some things very sketchy about Theodore Roosevelt, but I'm going to focus on the good. He was a conservationist, and he broke up a lot of monopolies, with the antitrust going on. The Bull Moose Party unfortunately competed with Eugene Debs's Socialist Party in 1912, but hey. And you could tiptoe through even the mid 20th century, not necessarily related to economics, but Earl Warren, appointed by Dwight Eisenhower to be the Chief Justice of the U.S. Supreme Court. Earl Warren was the greatest Supreme Court Chief Justice this country ever had, and he was a Republican. So all the people who are conservatives in this audience here, and they're like, oh, American socialist democracy is always making cheap shots at Republicans. I gave you a small list of Republicans that I admire. Norman Thomas was initially a Republican before joining the Socialist Party of America. And it was basically his Republican values that brought him into the Socialist Party of America. You can make that argument. He joined the Socialist Party of America in 1917 with the Great War that was going on in Europe. Great War being known today as World War I. Because the Socialist Party of America took a pacifist position of being against war, because their argument was that that workers of the world do have to unite, and we have more in common with each other than our governments who oppresses us, and the wealthy people who oppresses us that control the government. Unlike their counterparts in Europe, whether it was the British Labour Party or the German Social Democrats or the French Socialists or what have you, the Russian Social Democrats, they all took a side to side with their governments fighting against each other. I think that the only political party other than the Socialist Party of America that thought that there was some bullshit to the war in Great War Europe was the Italian Socialist Party. I believe that they sort of viewed it the same way. But Norman Thomas joined the Socialist Party in 1917, and because of the Espionage Act that was taking place. The Espionage Act was basically shut down dissent against America entry into World War I. For all the progressives and liberals in this day and age that praises or have positive good feelings about President Woodrow Wilson, let me just tell you, Woodrow Wilson was probably one of the worst presidents this country ever had. The man was a flaming racist. Yeah, I mean, the correlation with Norman Thomas's, I believe it was political science. He taught at Princeton University, and Norman Thomas was one of his students. And that's just a historical overlap there. But as the president of the United States, Woodrow Wilson resegregated the city of Washington, D.C. He watched the birth of the nation in the White House. The Birth of the Nation was the movie about the Ku Klux Klan. He was prejudiced. He was bigoted. He was also very, very much anti-civil liberties. He crushed any protest against the war. So a lot of the more radical labor unions were attacked. Socialists were attacked, anarchists were attacked, some Quakers were attacked. Uh, Victor Berger of Wisconsin, the first socialist elected to Congress, had his seat taken away from him and served and was sentenced, I believe, 10 years in prison. Eugene Debs, the leader of the Socialist Party of America, was also put in prison. It was, as I said, radicals were apprehended. And what happened was that the National Civil Liberties Bureau was created. And I believe Norman Thomas joined around that time, even though he was not a lawyer. You would know what the National Civil Liberties Bureau is because it changed its name in 1920 to the American Civil Liberties Union. It was created by the Socialist Party of America. People like Clarence Darrow was a member. Eugene Debs and Norman Thomas were early supporters of the ACLU. I have been a member of the ACLU over the years myself, but I'm not relevant to this discussion. Just saying. The ACLU, the NCLB actually, were representing radicals, the radical labor unions, the socialists, the anarchists, the Quakers, Bible students, which would become known as Jehovah's Witnesses later on. They got harassed too, even though they weren't political. Anybody who was opposed to fighting in Europe and opposing the U.S. policy of war. Woodrow Wilson pretty much crush any dissent that was going on in this country. Supreme Court found a technicality in the sentencing of Victor Berger, and he was released from prison, ran again for Congress in 1920, and he was refused a seat in Congress. He ran again in 1922, gained that seat back, and served in Congress until his death in 1929. People who serve in the state assembly in places like New York from the Socialist Party were also denied their seats, and a lot of them never got their seats in the New York legislature back. We were a strong third party. I say we because in my heart of hearts, I am of that tradition, the Socialist Party of America. Norman Thomas was to carry on his career, and he left the clergy. He left his vocation as a Presbyterian minister to move on, and he worked with the American Civil Liberties Union. I believe he was also worked for the Nation magazine as well. After the failed campaign of Robert La Follette for president in the year 1924, 2 years later, Eugene Debs died, even though he was too old to run in the year 1928. Norman Thomas rose up into the leadership of the Socialist Party of America, and from 1928 to the year 1948, in every presidential election, 1928, 1932, 1936, 1940, 44, and 48, Norman Thomas was the presidential candidate for the Socialist Party of America. During that time, like for example, he was involved in Arkansas in helping and assisting in the creation of the Southern Farmers Tenant Union, which was the first biracial union of black and white migrant farmers, tenant farmers, who actually formed a union and were collective bargaining in places like Arkansas, where it was not exactly union friendly and certainly was not civil rights friendly when it came to equality for for Negroes, as they were referred to at that time. Norman Thomas actually contributed to the creation of this small Southern Farmers Tenant Union, which were actually creating decent contracts for black and white workers alike that worked in these farms. He rose up in the ACLU as the executive director, and I believe he served as the executive director of the American Civil Liberties Union from 1932 to 1954, I believe. I know it was in the early 50s. And was responsible for the ACLU's direction into fighting for civil liberties, constitutional rights, free speech, an organization that's to this day has actually called bullshit on every president. And when I hear, especially Republicans attacking the ACLU, oh, they're just partisan Democrats. Bullshit. ACLU is actually legally challenged every president from Woodrow Wilson all the way up to Donald Trump and everyone in between. The ACLU has consistently found things wrong with every presidential administration, Democrat and Republican alike. And with Joe Biden coming around the corner, I'm sure the ACLU will not stop. During the 1930s, the platform of the Socialist Party of America, which called for what would become Social Security, they were calling for jobs, projects. These things were becoming a reality. Social Security, recognition of unions, 8-hour workday, getting rid of child labor, infrastructure modernization, things like the Tennessee Valley Authority. You think about it. Prior to the TVA, that area of Tennessee had a horrible flooding problem, and businesses did not find it profitable to build a dam out there. So the United States federal government went in. And because the United States federal government went in, a lot of industrialists and reactionaries are like, creeping socialism! Where the fuck were they to fill in that need? Well, as I said, a lot of the New Deal programs of the 1930s, which didn't go far enough, but it was still effective, and it did get us out of this Great Depression. During World War II, when the Japanese invaded Pearl Harbor, our United States government, one of the worst things FDR did was to round up Japanese Americans living here in the United States, putting them in these internment camps. They weren't particularly cruel to the Japanese Americans, but the fact that you took a whole group of people in the United States and you put them in camps. The only organizations that stood against that was the Socialist Party of America, led by Norman Thomas, and the American Civil Liberties Union, led by Norman Thomas. Not even the Communist Party, who were actually better on organizing and working with African Americans for racial equality, were all that concerned about what was going on against the Japanese Americans. I'm not particularly keen on communism, but I do give the Communist Party USA a credit and owe them a great deal of respect for their contributions for fighting for racial equality for African Americans. They are to be commended for that. The Socialist Party, same thing. What we did with the Japanese Americans. Well, as I said, he kept on running for president. Of course, never winning. In 1948, he ran for the very last time. The 1948 election was interesting because, again, another progressive party. You had the Bull Moose in 1912, the Progressive Party of Theodore Roosevelt, the Progressive Party of Robert La Follette in 1924, and then you got the Progressive Party of former Vice President Henry Wallace from the Franklin Roosevelt administration, not Governor George Wallace of Alabama, but Henry Wallace, Vice President Henry Wallace, who's from Iowa, not Alabama, um, ran as the Progressive Party candidate for president. And there was talks to have the Socialist Party of America join in with the Progressives, but because there was too much communist influence with the Progressive Party, Socialist Party was like, thanks, but no thanks, and they went on their own. And of course, after 1948, the Socialist Party of America declined even further and further. 1952, Darlington Hoops ran, and he ran again in 1956. And then after that, the Socialist Party of America never ran any candidate for president again, except for the faction of the Socialist Party of America that became the Socialist Party USA after 1972. But Norman Thomas continued to work for civil rights for African Americans, continued to work for democratic socialism here at home, and to work for peaceful resolve in the international community. A side note about Norman Thomas, that he was one of the first figures on the American left in the 1950s that questioned the existence of Israel. When Israel was founded in 1948, it was actually supported largely by the left around the world. Soviet Union actually was the first country to establish diplomatic relations with Israel, and for, I guess, roughly about a decade, the Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc countries had positive relations with the country. Israel was created as a socialist state where there was a lot of support at that time. Norman Thomas began to question whether Israel were not necessarily should they exist, but their treatment against the Arab minorities over there, the Palestinians. And, it didn't set too well with many members of the Socialist Party who were Jewish and were very understandably supportive of the Jewish state. So, ironically, I used to think that it was the far left that were the first people to abandon support for Israel, but it was actually the softer left politics of Norman Thomas. And that was just kind of a interesting little side note about that. But Norman Thomas remained a very respected man over the years. In 1963, he worked with A. Philip Randolph, Bear Rustin, and Martin Luther King to have the March on Washington for jobs and freedoms and civil rights. So Martin Luther King, that was the march where Martin Luther King delivered his speech, "I Have a Dream," 1963. Norman Thomas was with them over there. And in fact, Martin Luther King wrote a short story about Norman Thomas called "The Greatest Man I Ever Known." And it was a story about a young black boy with his grown-up father. hearing a white man speak. And the little boy asks his father, "Daddy, who's that man?" And the father said, "Son, that man is Norman Thomas. He was with us before all the other white folks started joining us." It was Martin Luther King's, you know, praising of Norman Thomas. And Martin Luther King was very, very much orbited around the Socialist Party of America. Well, during the 1960s, Norman Thomas, well, was mentioned in a very cultural reference way in the movie Take Her, She's Mine, starring Jimmy Stewart, whereby in the movie, Jimmy Stewart, who's plays the character of Frank Michelson, his daughter Sandra Dee is at college, and she's writing back to her father. And the reference, I'm going to try to remember what he was saying, talking about how great college is. And I heard a speech, nuclear disarmament by Norman Thomas. That was my terrible impression of Jimmy Stewart, which ironically almost sounds like Norman Thomas too when he was alive. Norman Thomas debated Barry Goldwater in 1962. He went on to be the first guest on Firing Line with William Buckley, 1966. He was against the war in Vietnam, spoke at many anti-war rallies, and was known for his remarks about flag desecration, urging Americans who are questioning policies of the United States to not burn or desecrate the flag, but instead wash it of its impurities, to just put it in a bucket and wash it. He urged a public washing of the flag. Norman Thomas died December 19, 1968, and of old age. He would have been 136 today. He's one of my heroes. And you could make an argument that Eugene Debs and Norman Thomas paved way for Bernie Sanders. Anyway, if you like what you heard, hold on a second. So let me just say this before I do. If you to the late Norman Thomas, happy birthday. If you like what you heard, press like and comment. If you were bothered by it, comment anyway. As a First Amendment absolutist, it's my duty to inform you that if you are passionate about something and you have a platform, utilize it. If you're passionate about something and don't have a platform, develop that platform, utilize it, because we're the muckrakers of our time. Feel free to share the content on this channel, and most importantly, subscribe to this channel. Help it make it grow. And until next time, I am American Social Democracy, peace, and Bernie Sanders for president in the year 2024.